preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I should like to make a slight addition to what I have been talking about in the last lecture in discussing the reasons why the theory of the spontaneously developing instinct for destructiveness, which grows and grows and therefore needs to be controlled but nevertheless cannot be quite controlled, etc., why this theory is, in my opinion, not tenable. Before I go on, I should like to ask, can you all hear me? Because some people told me last time that some of you could not hear me well. Would anybody who cannot hear me now please raise their hands? Well, I do not. Do I see? Oh, yes. I cannot see well enough to see your hands. That's a trouble. Can you see? Could you possibly stand up? Because we can't see you from here. Well, all right, thank you. I should like to mention two things. One is the behavior of insane patients. As most of you know, it was generally assumed until not so long ago that many chronically insane patients were very violent. Therefore, one had to put them behind bars to protect them or others from their violence. And indeed, when there were, in spite of this, a number of incidents of violence. In recent years, one has made more and more experiments in the direction of not putting insane patients behind bars, of letting them live either in farms and working there, or in other forms, in other institutional forms in which they do not have to be shut up. And the interesting result is that in general the violence disappeared. There was little violence. And the less forcing there was, the less violence there was. Now, I think that is an interesting example for an assumption which is what one often calls a self-fulfilling prediction. You assume, and this is a remnant of the attitude toward a psychotic patient from the Middle Ages on, you assume because he cannot think in the same way a so-called normal person thinks, you have to put him behind bars. Then he shows a reaction which many a caged animal would show, violence. Then you have the proof that you were right in the first place, and therefore it was necessary to put him behind bars, when actually you produce the whole behavior for which you then get the proof. Now, that holds true for a great deal of violence, which is man-made, not only among psychotic patients. In fact, it is a very interesting question why there is not more violence than there is in the average citizen. But we shall talk about this question as we go on. I wanted, as a second footnote to this topic, mention an example to what extent the social atmosphere can change destructiveness or aggression. And I'm mentioning an example which to me is one of the most interesting demonstrations of this problem, and that is an institution for, let us say, orphaned children, which exists in Mexico, in fact in Cuernavaca, and which has been founded 12 years ago by an American priest, Father Wasson. He started out taking in children in his home, really, who came from prisons. As far as I remember, there were at first 10 or 12 children, mostly delinquent children, and you can imagine that the reason for the delinquency was a good deal of violence and aggressiveness or destructiveness, stealing, robbery, and so on. He has now 800 children, boys and girls, and there is practically no violence at all. There are no acts of overt aggression, of violence, of fights, of using weapons. There is as little violence as you would find among the best conditions among children who come from happy families. Now, these children are now, only to a smaller extent, children who come from prisons. They are all children who have no mother. That is to say, they had one, of course, once, but they have lost their mothers. And it is a condition that Father Wasson accepts only children who have no mothers. The logic of it is, or the rationale of it is, that as long as a child has a mother, the mother can take care of the child. If the child has no mother, then somebody else must take care of the child. Well, if one is very cynical, one might think of some favorable side effects which the absence of mothers may have for the development of the children, but I won't go into that. He makes a second condition, and that is that he takes only all of the children of one family, or none. That is to say, the children, brothers and sisters, remain together. And therefore, there is a sense of unity which remains among the children. They have not fully lost their identity as coming from one family. There is another condition: he does not give any child away for adoption. Not at all for egotistical reasons. On the contrary, he could get a lot of money if he permitted that, but because he wants that the children feel completely secure, that they are not one day forced to go to some home of some people to whom they are given. Well, let me describe to you briefly what are the main methods of this institution for orphan children. But they are orphaned only as far as the mother is concerned. But very, very frequently, orphaned completely, because very frequently the father has left, abandoned them, and so on. That's not a rare pattern in the Mexican rural family. The main conditions are: A, complete security. No child is ever sent away for whatever reason. There is nothing a child could do for which it will be fired or sent out of the institution. Secondly, no punishment. No punishment except the, well, I'm looking for words. If I say except, there is really no punishment. No corporal punishment. There is no atmosphere of punishment of any kind. There's no punitive atmosphere. If the child is behaving very badly, then what we might call the headmaster of that group would talk to him, explain to him, but there is no need even for any kind of punishment, and it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean at all that the children are coddled or that the children are treated in any sentimental way. On the contrary, the whole atmosphere is one of realism. It's not one that they should live out their aggression, and the idea being that then the aggression will dry up and they will feel better. This is not at all what is expected, and there is, as I said before, very little aggression which appears. Further features of the institutions are things I explained. That is to say, there is no analysis of the child, there is no great psychological, these people have no psychological tests. I have recently begun to suggest some psychological testing because I was interested in a study on juvenile delinquents. Well, they were mildly interested, but really, when most institutions these days would have started with many, many psychological testing and then built perhaps construct a model along the tests. This was completely absent there. But there is explanation. There is, talking about things in a reasonable way and in a friendly way. Then there is a great deal of stimulation. The children have their carpenter shop, their dancing lessons, their music lessons, their gramophone records, aside from their own gardens and so on. That is to say, life is interesting. Another feature, which I think is one of the most important features, is the degree of self-management introduced in this organization. The groups choose, especially the older ones in high school age, choose their own chief. This chief changes every 2 months. He represents them vis-à-vis the administration. And he has the actual role of the chief during these 2 months. Their kitchen is completely managed by themselves. They buy, they make their menus, and they cook. Nobody interferes, again, with a temporary chief of changing every 2 months. And it functions without any difficulties. Now, perhaps the kitchen might be the most concrete examples to many of you, it is at least to me, how the system works, because you can talk your way out of many situations, but if the cooking doesn't work, if they don't buy properly, if they make a mess of cooking, then indeed the whole organization falls down. And it does, and it functions marvelously. Now, the spirit of the whole place is a religious spirit. It's an institution headed by a Catholic priest. Most children attend Mass. Most children go to confession. However, they are by no means forced to attend Mass or to go to confession. There's no control, and if they don't like to, no questions are asked. But the concept of religiosity, which is prevalent here, is one which has all its emphasis on charity and overcoming one's greed and egoism, not on sin in a sexual sense, not on sins against God, not on sins of thoughts, but the whole system is centered on a sense of compassion, charity versus egotism and greediness. Well, naturally, this is expressed in religious Christian terms. It would not be any difficult to express the very same thing in other terms. They could be Buddhist, they could be humanist. At least I do not see that there would be any difference. The result is that with this whole system of security, a spirit of kindness, a spirit of realism and self-management, you have an orphanage. That is to say, you have institutionalized children who are probably much better off psychologically than children in a great number of normal families. And I mention this example because it indicates something more. It says something not only about the problem of aggression, but it says something about the problem of organization and organization. So we talk so much about, and this is a topic which is much discussed in these last few years, of institutionalized children, how bad that can be for infants, how they may suffer from the lack of love. And the assumption is always that is inherent in the fact of the institution and is not present in the family. Well, here you have an institution and institutionalized children who live in an atmosphere of happiness, of interest, of affection, which is not so frequently found in a family. Because it is a different kind of institution, it's a non-bureaucratic institution, it is a humanly directed institution, it has different principles. To mention only a little detail which might also interest you, for instance, the beds have no numbers, but they have different colors. The rooms have no numbers, but they have different names. While all over Mexico, school children have to wear uniforms, these children do not wear uniforms. It is an anti-bureaucratic, anti-authoritarian, humanistic spirit, in spite of the fact that an orphanage for 800 children is quite an enterprise. Well, they have very, very few problems. Not only about aggression, but about other things. Very few behavior problems. There is hardly a need. A psychologist really in this environment would not be very successful for lack of practice. There is hardly need for the intervention of a psychologist. Well, this is an unscientific, old-fashioned, very realistic, very commonsensical, and extremely effective kind of setup. And I think if one thinks of all these problems of the allegedly innate destructiveness and aggression, and how difficult it is to curb it, and on the other hand, the institution is such as if it were all necessarily without warmth and had these bad effects, I think to think of such an example is quite useful to keep one's perspective that institutions are not institutions, and one can do things in very different ways. The main thing is to see other alternatives to the things, to the way in which we do things. The trouble with most of our thinking, I'm afraid, is that we do not see other options, other alternatives. We set up usually two alternatives which are equally bad, and then we can choose the one or the other. But we do not take the one step, which is the only fruitful one, namely to see something new. And that is precisely what the human brain is capable of if we get out of the compulsion of thinking in terms of patterns which are already set. Well, I come back now to the point which I've been talking about, which I want to cover today, namely the whole problem that man is not destructive because of his instincts, not because of his animal inheritance. On the contrary, man is much more destructive than the animal, and that we have to look for the conditions of human destructiveness in the specific conditions of human existence. And I was saying last time at the end of the lecture that among these specific conditions which we have to look for is awareness, imagination, the fact of loneliness, the fact of boredom, and the experience of impotence. And I don't mean sexual impotence here. The experience of having no weight, of being nobody, of being zero, of not filling space, which the human being can have, and there is a little likelihood that the animal has the same kind of experience. And therefore, that we have to investigate the different kinds of destructiveness and the conditions which exist for every type of destructiveness, because according to the difference of destructiveness, the conditions are also different. And so I begin today with the first category, and that is destruction without destructive intention. That is to say, I commit a destructive act. I shoot somebody, but I have no intention, no hostility towards him. Is that possible? Well, let me begin with a few examples. For instance, you have a good deal of primitive warfare, which is, or let me perhaps speak of the first type of this destructiveness without destructive intention. That is what I would call playful destruction, or display of skill. Namely, where a person enjoys displaying a skill without intention to hurt. But what matters to him is to display his skill. Now, you find in many primitive tribes this phenomenon, but let me give you an example about which you can read more easily and which is also more precise, and that is the role of fighting in Zen Buddhist tradition. I'm thinking especially of sword fighting, in which is an old Buddhist tradition, Zen Buddhist tradition, that is to say, the skill in fighting with another person, and theoretically, if both had the same skill, they could never harm each other. And as Dr. Suzuki said once in a conversation about this topic, the person who is harmed happens to be in the wrong place because the other person, his opponent, just made the right movements. But he had no intention of killing. He had no destructive, aggressive intention. And it is quite clear that according to the Zen Buddhist concept, any aggressive, destructive impulse would greatly weaken his capacity to fight. Because this capacity to fight is an extremely fine organization of bodily movements, of observation, of motor action and so on, and it would be disturbed and would be thrown out of balance if the person were motivated by feelings of rage and so on. Perhaps I could tell you a story which is quite telling in this respect. This is the story of master, it's a Zen Buddhist story of a master of the tea ceremony. Well, many of you know one of the arts of Zen Buddhism is the tea ceremony, preparing tea in a certain way, and there are masters of this art. Well, it happened that one of these masters of the tea ceremony was more or less forced by his superior to accompany him to another part of Japan, and he didn't want to go because he was afraid that there he would be challenged by samurais, by warriors. He had to dress like a warrior in order to go there. And indeed, after a few days, he was one of the samurais met him, challenged him to a duel. And he said to him, "But I'm not really a sword master, I'm a tea master." And the samurai said it didn't care what he was. Here he was challenged and he had to come to the duel. Well, the tea master was, of course, in a very embarrassing situation. He thought, all right, at least he wanted to die with dignity. And so he went to a famous master of sword fighting in this town and confronted him with his problem and asked him, could he teach him at least how to hold the sword, what to do in order to die with some dignity. And the sword master told him, don't worry, please be kind enough to serve me tea. Well, the tea master did that, and he did that in his way of perfection. And after that was over, he asked the sword master, so now tell me, what do I do in an hour from now? And the sword master said, don't worry, just imagine you are serving tea, and everything will go by itself. He met the samurai. He put himself in a position of serving tea, but in this attitude, he was so concentrated, so powerful, so totally himself, that the samurai fell on his knees and begged for his life. The point of the story, as you will notice, is that it isn't even the skill of the sword fighting which is important. It is the skill of the whole concentration of a person, of the intensity, of the attitude of complete concentration, which is a basis of his skill. And that this attitude alone is so remarkable and so noticeable that it would frighten another person who tries to fight with this man. Well, I give you that as an example for the fact that in Zen Buddhist sword fighting, the intention is not at all one of destruction, one of hostility. It is a display of tremendous skill, coordination, control of the body, and so on and so on. You see that perhaps a little clearer when you take another Zen Buddhist art, that of archery. I would recommend very much to you, for those who do not know the book by Herigel, H-E-R-R-I-E-G-E-L. He was a German professor of philosophy who went to Japan to study the art of archery, and he wrote a book about it, which is most interesting and most revealing to understand what is skill in this Japanese sense. In this book you will find, for instance, a description that one day he thought he'd find a little trick, a technical invention to make it easier to do the job. The master noticed that. The master noticed that this was not what he had taught him, but that he tried in a technical way to solve the problem rather than in a total human way. So the master turned around and left the room. And it required the intervention of many friends until the master permitted him to return to continue with his lessons. He began from the beginning again, and after, I think, 7 years, Herigel had learned the art of archery. And then the master told him, now you go, you don't need to write me, send me a photo from time to time, then I see how you are. Now, that is, of course, you can use archery for killing, and it is used that way in certain parts of the world, or has been used. But it has nothing to do with the Japanese or with the Zen art of archery. That is an art, and it's not destruction. Now, of course, you can say that, but unconsciously, there is destructiveness. Unconsciously, there is narcissism. Unconsciously, there is aggression. Well, of course, all that is possible. And I don't deny that in many instances that might very well be the case. But I do believe that seen from the standpoint of the specific Zen art of sword fighting or archery, if these motives are present, then the man who practices this art will not be an accomplished sword fighter or an accomplished master in the art of archery, because his skill will be perverted, inhibited, twisted by an emotion of destructiveness, which is in contrast to what he tries to do. Let me come to the second type of destruction without destructive intent. Or I should better say, without necessarily having a destructive intention. And this is a very serious and very complicated problem. It has sometimes been called in the psychological literature instrumental aggression or instrumental destructiveness. By instrumental is meant that the aggression is meant or used as an instrument for something else, namely to get something. The case is very simple. I want something, you have got it, you don't give it to me voluntarily, so I rob it, I steal it, or I kill you in order to get it. I don't hate you, I don't want to harm you, I'm not interested in harming you, but I'm interested in getting what you have got. So I rob, I steal, I kill. But in this act, there is not necessarily any destructive intention or any destructive desire. I wish to emphasize it necessarily. Naturally, in many cases, there will be. You might say, in many cases, many more cases, there will be traces of destructiveness. But in many cases, there will not be subjective feelings of hostility or destructiveness. And I shall talk a little bit more about that. Examples, of course, are frequent. They are the examples of predatory warfare in many tribes. They are the examples of modern warfare. They are the examples of murder, robbery, assault. They are the examples of what you find described in cold blood of two people who just murder a family because they expect to get a few $1,000s. Now, we are appalled by this. We are appalled by the idea that two people should kill in cold blood in order to get some money. We are much less appalled, strangely enough, if a country attacks another country in order to get some territory or some political advantage. Our pattern of thought is that this falls into entirely different categories. Appallingly, these are murderers which we cannot even identify ourselves with. And on the other hand, this is something which we know from thousands of years of history. We take it for granted. And actually, what is the difference? In both cases, assuming that in the case of war it's not a defense against an attack, in both cases, people, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are killed in order to get something they have and I want to have, or my country wants to have, or the other country wants to have. Let us take another difference. Let us say, for instance, stealing. We suppose stealing is very often nothing but instrumental aggression. I want something, I have not the money to buy it, so I steal it. Now, I harm another person. In fact, sometimes it depends from whom I steal. I don't harm another person. But let us assume I harm another person. I do violate the social order. That's true enough. But let us assume a person who competes, a businessman who competes with another businessman, or a man in the bureaucracy who competes with another man in the bureaucracy. He wants to ruin that business so that his business is greater. And he does all sorts of things perfectly legally to undermine the reputation, to make difficulties for that business, to sell cheaper so that the other man cannot compete, and eventually has ruined the business and has ruined the man, and possibly his reputation has made him very unhappy. Now, what is the difference? In both cases, somebody wanted to get something, and he was not hesitant to inflict harm on the other person in order to get it. But from the standpoint of our thought patterns, it seems a great deal of difference, because our thought patterns assume that violation of the law is, if law is violated, the action is one thing. If it's not violated, it's another thing. If an individual does something, it's one thing. If a state does something, it's another thing. I want to draw your attention simply to the fact that if we speak of aggression destructiveness, if we speak here about this instrumental aggression, how much we do not really see clearly, or to what extent we do not see clearly that we deal with what we deal with, that we are conditioned by certain patterns of thought in which legal and social patterns of thought are much more important than the very facts, and yet we rationalize, in one case, our condemnation of theft by saying this is violence and another person shouldn't be harmed. But we do not apply the same principle if the same violence is applied under legal conditions and does not violate the patterns of our social life. I'm not saying here that stealing is good. It has many disadvantages, quite aside from the violation of law and the menace to social order. I'm only trying to say that we must accustom ourselves, if we really want to understand violence, to see the facts very clearly and not to indulge in our prejudices that one thing is good here and the same thing is bad there, depending on the social pattern under which it is subsumed. Take, for instance, the Aztec human sacrifices. Now, the Aztec sacrificed sometimes 25, 30,000 people at one day. They tore their heart out, and the corpses were eaten. 25,000 people on one fiesta, on one day. And the idea being that this was necessary because otherwise, if the gods would not have the blood of these captives, of these men who were sacrificed, the cosmos could not run. Now, most of us are shocked, deeply shocked, and think this is deeply inhuman, this is revolting. Well, it is revolting. But then let us ask, what is the difference between this and modern warfare? I think the Aztec rationalization that they had to do that in order to guarantee the existence of the cosmos is at least as reasonable and respectable as a rationalization of modern states, which justify the killing of millions, of many millions of people. It just happens to be a thought pattern which we don't have anymore, so we feel that is terribly inhuman, while when we are dealing with thought patterns which we acknowledge as being normal, the same phenomenon has an entirely different aspect. And for all we know, the priests of the Aztecs who killed all these people may not have been necessarily so cruel, nor the generals or the leaders of modern nations who begin wars may not be personally cruel. This depends very much on the circumstances. I'm only using these examples in order to indicate how different all these cases of aggression sound depending on what kind of pattern, thought pattern we have. Now, let me say a word here about a phenomenon which we have witnessed a week ago, and that was a looting in the Negro ghettos in many cities in the United States. Now, there was a great deal of fear, apparently, on the side of the white majority that this looting would endanger the lives and property and the social order of the state. So the looting was made out to be, by many people, something very violent. Now, actually, if you examine the looting, there was no particular destructiveness in it. There was a dramatic moment which set an emotional shock, and young people mostly, but then also older people, took what they could from the windows, from the stores whose windows were smashed. If you think of our peculiar preparation of people, that they are constantly seduced to want things, to buy things, and in the poor population, constantly frustrated in getting what they are seduced to want. Well, this is something which would drive a cat neurotic in the experimental laboratory. And I don't think it is anything astonishing that under certain critical circumstances, then a number of people would explode, but not their destructiveness. In fact, we have heard so much these days of to be said against violence. The fact is that Martin Luther King was shot. The fact is that over 20 people were killed, of whom most of whom were Negroes. The fact is that in these incidents, the violence and destructiveness was by no means anything as intense or deep as it was made out to be, in my opinion. That's why it has been often observed that these boys were gay, these people were laughing. Sure, they are not, they had a holiday because suddenly, you might say, they felt for a moment they were in the promised land. And the promised land in our culture is to have more commodities, to have the bigger television sets, to have the freezers. That is the dream of our society. And if you take a deprived social class who cannot afford this, exploding for a moment, and in a moment of, you might say, enthusiasm of a peculiar kind. I'm not saying it is a very productive and positive enthusiasm. Well, there's nothing to be so surprised of. I only mean to emphasize, if you look at these phenomena, I don't think you find any deep-seated destructiveness which corresponds to the fact which had happened, namely the killing of one of the most significant leaders of the American Negro population. Now we come to another question, and that is a question: what are the inhibitory factors? Why don't people steal and kill if they want something? Well, in the first place, we have to consider one fact, and that is, what do people really want? It's one thing that a person is willing to kill in defense of his life, that a person is willing to steal because he is hungry or starving. But it's quite another thing that a person is willing to steal or to kill in order to have a television set, or a new car, or a better car, or a freezer. The more greed we develop, the more, of course, we increase the need for aggressive acts which are not born out of aggressive motives, but which turn out to be aggressive because people want to get things which they don't have. Here, one of the problems is that in our culture, we cultivate greed with the same intensity as the Ten Commandments forbid covetousness. It is the main principle of the Ten Commandments of the New Testament and of Buddhism to say, you shall not covet. Don't be greedy. This is really, in the nutshell, the most elementary ethical norm. And our whole system functions with the aim of making people greedy. And there is no end to it, to this greediness, because, the private automobile is perhaps the most devilish invention in this respect, because, not only because it's completely uneconomical, because it eventually ruins our cities, because it makes eventually the traffic in our cities impossible, but because it is an object of unlimited greed. You can make it more and more expensive. You can have one car and two cars and three cars. Your prestige is connected with it. Your self-esteem is connected with it. You are the car, or rather the car is you. And for a young man, it is his car rather than whatever he has to offer that may be attractive to the girls. I don't know. Maybe that has changed in the meantime. Things change quickly. Certainly it has changed in certain parts of the young generation. But altogether, in a culture which is built on the constant increase of greed for things, you necessarily have an increase in destructive acts, and you have an increase of frustration, because you can, and an increase in competition. You can never have all you want. Now, you might say, once we have complete automation and once our industrial system has developed to a point in which there is nothing short of complete satisfaction of every wish and whim a person might have, this would end. Well, in the meantime, some time will pass. In the meantime, you have another phenomenon, and that is that the industrialized countries become richer and the unindustrialized countries become poorer, that the gap between the two parts of the world becomes greater rather than smaller, that very serious specialists in the field predict that we cannot avoid already now a famine in 10 years from now in certain parts of the world. In other words, that while you might even dream of the United States being so affluent that greed for things will cease, you will then have on a world scale a situation in which this very affluence would provide an amount of greed among those who have nothing, that the United States or other industrialized country would be the target of a hate and of a wish for destruction, as maybe the few looted stores might be for a few boys now, but I think a much more serious target than that. Now, in other words, the degree of instrumental aggression depends, first of all, on the degree of your greed, on the degree of what you want to have. Whether this remains on the scale of normal human necessities, or whether it is an artificially and ever-increasing need for more and more. It seems that, quite in contrast to the theory that destructiveness is ever-increasing, what really is ever-increasing is our thirst for goods and commodities. That does not seem to have any limit, and not because there is a natural innate drive for that, because our industry, with its needs to control the market, to increase their production, etc., creates with all means, and they are not small, all the instruments to make people wish to have more and more things and to consume more and more. A second question is, what is inhibitory is, of course, a fear of punishment. Fear of punishment is one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is simply conditioning. If you condition a rat that when it does this, it gets an electric shock, the rat will, what psychologists call, learn. That is to say, it will eventually, after a few times, be wise enough not to touch this lever because it wants to avoid the shock. Now, of course, this learning does not need any large brain. It is a mechanism which an animal with a much lower scale of development can perform, and I guess that is the idea which some psychologists and some other people have about the future of the human race, that if you apply this conditional mechanism, this is really all that you need in order to regulate human behavior. Well, that has its own problems. Another factor is, aside from punishment, of course, social disapproval. Man has a deep need to feel himself part of a group. And it is not just that he is afraid of his father and his mother. He may be afraid of his father and his mother, but he can stand all that if he lives in a group which approves. The influence of the group in which we live is much more powerful, I believe, than the influence of the earlier experiences with father and mother. It just happens much of the time that our society is patterned along the patterns of father and mother. And then, of course, it seems as if the whole cause is father and mother, and it is just repeated in one's attitude toward society. But if you observe, as a number of psychologists have, juvenile gangs, and gangs of delinquents, there you have a subculture in which there's no sense of guilt because the criminal behavior is approved by the group. On the contrary, the square behavior would be disapproved. They feel at home in this group, more at home than they ever felt in their family, and they would be afraid of not committing criminal acts, because then they would lose the one home they have, and that is to be a member of this group. Now there is a last question here which is of great importance, and which is very complex, and for which I think there are no sufficient answers. And that is a question of the role of empathy. I shall talk a little bit more about this next time, but I want at least to introduce now the subject matter. If I harm somebody, am I touched by his suffering, or am I not? Do I feel what he feels, and this inhibits me from hurting him, or am I not touched by it? This has nothing to do with my destructive intention. It is just the question whether my compassion exists for another being in such a way that I am inhibited, or I would not want to do something from which he suffers because his suffering would make me suffer. And the question is, with which I shall start next time before I come to the next group of destructiveness, how much empathy do we really have? What do we know about it? Is that an innate factor? Is it a culturally conditioned factor? Can the empathy be repressed? Does it depend on the family? Does it depend on the culture? What is the feeling anyway? This feeling in which one is deeply affected by another person's suffering, or for that matter, by another person's joy, or for that matter, by anything that happens to another person. If I may suggest something which would give me pleasure, it would be that you would think a little bit about it yourself and try to clarify in your own mind how much empathy, how much compassion you really have and you think other people have. What your estimate is about the incident of compassion in people in our world. There is a very appropriate time for this, to do this, and that is Easter, both the Christian Easter and the Jewish Easter, because certainly the Christian Easter has at its main topic the topic of compassion. But so has the Jewish Easter, at least in a certain respect. Its main topic is liberation. But I should like to remind you of something the Old Testament says, when it says, love the stranger, because you have been strangers in Egypt, and you know the soul of the stranger. That is to say, this is a command, if you please, or an admonition, to have compassion. And compassion is here defined as feeling what the other person feels because you are in his situation, or you have been in his situation, or because you put yourself in his situation. This is a great step, as far as I can see, beyond love thy neighbor, although this neighbor has been interpreted in different ways as being anyone or only being the member of the same, of one's own nationality. That is an somewhat unsolved problem. But here, in the command of the love of the stranger, there is no argument. It is made perfectly clear that the true love of another person is a capacity to love the stranger, that is to say, the person with whom you are not familiar by common language, common songs, and common food and common territory. The person who might even have been your enemy. And perhaps I could end this by telling you another story which has very much the same meaning, which also has a reference to the Jewish Eastern, and that is a story which I'm sure many of you know, that when the Egyptians were drowned in the Red Sea, the angels, who were of course supposed to be on the side of the Hebrews, started to sing psalms of joy. And when God heard this, he said, "How do you dare to sing hymns of joy when my creatures have perished?" And indeed, until this day, the custom of Orthodox Jewish community is that on the day which, according to the tradition, the Egyptians have been drowned, the customary psalms which are sung at every holiday, only half of them are sung out of deference for the death of the Egyptian army. This is quite a few years ago, about 3,400 years ago. This is a tradition of loving, you might say, the enemy, loving the stranger, which is an old tradition, which is to be found in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. It goes through Western tradition. How much of it is left is another question which any one of you can think about. Thank you. We'll have a 10 minutes intermission. Here's a question which says, there can be empathy between individuals. Can there be a sense of compassion between nations? This is a very interesting question, and I plan to talk next time in the beginning when I finish this discussion of compassion, empathy, precisely to say a little bit more about this point, which I hope is somewhat an answer to this. Here's a question. Would you care to suggest a few books to supplement your lectures? Yes, I shall do that. There is one book which I can, at this point, warmly recommend to all of you, because I think it's one of the most important books which has been written on the subject of man in recent years, and that is by Lewis Mumford, The Myth of the Machine. If you want to understand something about the psychological, cultural, social, economic factors influencing man, determining the shape of man, of his society, beyond that which is well known, then indeed I would recommend to read this book, The Myth of the Machine, by Lewis Mumford. It was published about, I think about 8 months ago, and has not found the amount of attention which it deserves. But I think this is nothing to be so surprised of, because many people prefer the shallowness of books like Audrey, or in this respect Lawrence, to the depth of a book like that of Lewis Mumford. I wished I could recommend you a great number of books which I could truly recommend, but I can't, and I don't want to recommend you the books which I think are not good. I have mentioned them, of course, already. I can give you the titles next time so as not to indoctrinate you by withholding you a knowledge which all of you have because they have been highly advertised. But maybe the one or the other title will occur to me which I can really recommend. Here's a question: how about jealousy when it comes to predatory warfare? Isn't this a strong motive for wanting an object which we do not have, but which our neighbors might have? Isn't it instrumental aggression? Is this instrumental aggression not a destructive one after all? Well, this is a very complicated problem. You find, for instance, in our civilization, some men who fall in love only with women who are married, and some only with the wives of their friends. That is, fortunately, the exception. But it is nevertheless a very a pattern which you can detect in, it's no difficult in detecting it, in some men. Now, what you have in warfare, in primitive warfare, is probably something else, and that is that the woman symbolizes the strength, the honor, the power of your enemy. And if you can take his women, then you have hurt the enemy in his deepest pride. So it isn't so much there the jealousy or the sexual attraction. It is rather a symbol of conquest. I think you find the same thing if you study such phenomena as the raping of women at the conquest of Berlin by the Russian soldiers, or East Germany, or the infamous rape of Nanking by the Japanese soldiers. And you find it throughout history that the complete conquest of a city implied also the conquest of the women, and is very different from what we usually would call a sexual motive. But I shall talk about this later on in one of these lectures. In a society where increased consumption generates added productivity, thereby increasing gross national product, why should consumption demand, namely greed, not be generated, and also not be considered a good because of its economic repercussions? Well, this is one of the basic decisions, value decisions we should make and which we don't make. It's one of the most basic ones. What is higher? The Bible defines it Caesar or God. If one is not a believer, we might say life or Caesar. We have to decide, do we want a society which has as its primary aim the unfolding growth, aliveness of man, or do we want a society which has as its primary aim the maximum consumption of things which only help people overcome their boredom because they have very little interest and joy in their daily lives? We are all already so programmed that we take it for granted that economic efficiency is an unquestionable good. Now, most of history has not assumed that economic efficiency was an unquestionable primary value. But this is part of our programming by which most of us are affected, and we don't even see anymore the options, that this is at least one choice, that there are other choices. And the other choices are to have a more interesting life, even if production is less efficient. And that means that we have less commodities in an affluent society like that of the United States. Here's a question: what is the name of orphanage in Cuernavaca? What happens to the children when they become adults, and how have they gotten on out in the world? Well, the first question is easy to answer. The name is Nuestros Pequeños Hermanos, our little brothers, would also arrive, Cuernavaca, Morelos, Mexico. The second question is much more difficult to answer because the whole institution exists only 12 years, and they began with small children, and there are not yet so many children who have gone out into the world. Incidentally, there is also an interesting point. Nobody is forced to leave. It's not a set date. When you have graduated from high school, you have to go. If they want to stay longer, then can stay longer. Eventually, when they find the right job and the right conditions, they leave. But they are never thrown out bureaucratically because their time is up. Now, what happens to them later? There are too few data which are available at the moment to give really reliable answer. But my whole point was not, in talking about it, to prove how this will change the world, how with this method these children will later on become so different from others. Maybe they don't, because it's awfully difficult, even with this background, to be confronted with a world whose principles are exactly the opposite of the charity and love which they experience in their homes. You might ask the same question about children who grow up in a family, which is really a loving family, an alive family. And what happens to them when they are 10 years out of the family and get into business or in the academic career, which is sometimes worse. You can say many times later experiences are stronger than what they experienced as children, and the same would hold true for these children. The reason why I mentioned this experiment is only to indicate that there can be institution which is different from another type of institution, and there is not this particular kind of aggressiveness which you expect to find and which you find in the same Mexican children, rural children or slum children in the city, because there are conditions which are so satisfactory and make life so interesting that the aggressive tendencies dry out and other tendencies are fed and therefore grow. Here's a question: could fact of looting so as to be integrated into market-oriented culture demonstrate that even among deprived groups there is little potential for revolutions? I think that's perfectly true. The people who looted only proved that their motivations were exactly the same of people who have more money and can buy. But that the most important thing for them is to experience that ecstasies of suddenly having things which they cannot buy. I wasn't defending the looting from any standpoint. I was only saying, well, it's not a matter of my defending it or accusing it. Anyway, I was only saying that it seemed to me, from what I observed, this looting is not particularly destructive, that it is an outburst which is very natural of relatively small proportions of attention, which is based on this frustration which I was talking about of being seduced to like all these things and being frustrated in the sense of not having them. But certainly there's nothing revolutionary about it. There is not even something, I had the impression, in which there was great hate in or destructiveness in it. Now, I do not mean to say that this could not come. There is a point here and in other parts of the world where hate and destructiveness can develop, which does not the harmless, relatively harmless qualities of looting a few stores and putting fire to a few houses, but in which you have a hate and a wish for destruction which is greater than your wish to live, in which your hate becomes identified with yourself, in which nothing counts anymore. This is indeed a very serious problem. And then the normal method of appeasing this hate do not suffice. I hope very much that this will not occur to the extent to which one might fear it will occur. But what we have seen this time, I do not consider a significant outbreak of destructiveness. Here's a question: do you believe that Zen Buddhism practices more than any other religion or philosophy the development of what you call specifically human or transcendental potentialities? No, I think a true Zen Buddhist or a true Christian or a true Jew would be equally concerned with love and with not hating. The trouble is that there are not so many people who are what they preach they are, or what they advertise to be. And of course, if you take the best Zen Buddhist sources, and then you take the best Hasidic sources, you take the best Christian sources, if you take the prophets, and if you take the Buddha, and if you take Meister Eckhart, then indeed you have one thing. If you take the practice, then you have something else. But I think you can see at the moment that the humanist tendencies in all these religious groups grow, some more, some less. Do you think greed can be eliminated under our present economic circumstances? No, I don't think so. I think, however, that there is probably no nation which has begun to question the meaningfulness and the sense of ever-increasing consumption as much as Americans. Americans have, and I'm sure millions of Americans, many millions, have begun and begin to see that more gadgets do not make them more happy, that this is not the road to happiness, that they remain inactive, passive, bored. And in fact, a great number of the young generation have shown that the way of their parents is something which they find boring and without any satisfaction. Whether their substitutes for something better are always the best ones is a question which is something else again. But if you take the less rich countries, then I would say that they believe in the happiness of more consumption is much more general, much less questioned than the United States. I'm sure that when you speak to an American audience about the senselessness of our consumers' attitude, that a certain number of people know what one is talking about and even agree or even have felt the same thing for a long time. I'm afraid if you make the same speech in Russia or in Czechoslovakia, there will be hardly anyone who would not think that only a fool could talk like that. Not to speak of countries in which now is a dream that the sovereignty of some small nation, Africa, is expressed by having its own steel mills or by its own hospitals, which are glass and aluminum. with the most modern machines. This is all fantastic. This is all copying a culture which is completely and with means which are inadequate. That's why Dr. Schweitzer was, toward the end of his life, calumniated as being an enemy of the Negroes, of the Africans, of having no respect for them, simply because he was a very honest man, or to be brief, he was a man, and therefore he did not pretend to admire what he didn't admire. He was not impressed by gadgets which would show that an African nation is very advanced because it could import some gadgets from Europe or America. I do believe that there is in the United States a great chance that this greediness for consumption might decrease, that there might be an increasing number of people who do not believe that having more things, using more things, is a sensible way of living, gives meaning to life. There's, for instance, in California, a group of students who have decided not to buy things which are not useful. That's nothing ascetic. It's not that they don't dress, or that they only, I don't know what, that they live like some Indian gurus when they come to America, but it just means that they decline to participate in that kind of consumption which our industry promotes and which our advertising promotes. So they will buy books and they will buy dresses, but they will not buy the latest and the most stylish thing because it just happens to be the fashion. Now, it's very interesting that people have concepts like this which you cannot even categorize clearly unless you really feel what all this is about. That it's not a matter of not buying anything. It's not a matter of asceticism. That is a protest against the way of life in which you cannot clearly define what your object of protest is, but in which you know what it is, and all the other people know exactly what it is too. And I think we do develop a new form of communication which is not anymore that of abstract categories, but you might say of feeling impulses, of blocks of feeling experiences, in which people know very well what is meant, because it's a commonly shared experience. And after all, language makes sense only on the basis of commonly shared experiences. Otherwise, it serves only to hide and not to express. And that is unfortunately mostly the case. And if, as a young generation does, you invent new words every year, well, that I don't think is a solution either, because the new words show only you are in the avant-garde and you know what is the latest. But what is the latest is not necessarily the best, quite regardless of whether it comes from the right or from the left. That is, I think, one of the troubles, that this concept that the latest is the best and the tradition is not worth anything, that, I'm afraid, is something about which there exists a great deal of unanimity about the very different sectors of our population. But nevertheless, I think that what I described here, and I'm very glad I had a chance to read and to answer this question, as the greediness of our present society is not anymore as deep-seated and as absolute a factor as it was perhaps 20 years ago. And in fact, I have hopes that there are possibilities of changing this pattern, but this depends on people waking up and asking themselves whether they really like what they do, whether they really like what they use, or whether they feel they have to like it because otherwise they are odd. And this fear of being odd is not just a psychological little twist. It has to do with our economic system, in which indeed being an individual is penalized. because one doesn't fit so well into the organization, and therefore one is afraid for one's promotion, and therefore one is afraid of one's wife, and therefore one is afraid of one's neighbors, and so on and so on. But I would not be surprised if there would be great changes in America in this respect, and I would think indeed then if these changes begin, perhaps then one could begin talking about the Christian or Jewish or religious or humanist tradition in America. If these changes do not begin, these are just words. Well, it's time to stop. Thank you. Today, many institutions of learning had closed their doors in tribute to the memory of Martin Luther King. So had the YMHA. I think it is fitting not to begin this lecture without speaking of him for a moment. Speaking of a man who has been killed because he represented the best that man has: love, courage, and hope. We have heard many words these days about him, some of them undoubtedly sincere, some of them trying to buy off action by words and all sorts of other gestures. But we know that words, even when they are sincere, especially in these days, very often are a substitute for genuine experience. And it seems to me there are only two ways to express the reaction to the murder of this man. One is action, and nothing could correspond to the words which have been uttered than an action radical enough that it requires the ending of the Vietnam War in a very short time. And the others would be expressions of poetry or music. And I think, since we do not, or I do not have these at my disposal, the best way to express our feelings are silence. Those of you who share this view of mine, I ask to rise for 1 minute silence. it may be fitting to make the transition between the expression of our reaction to the events of these days by talking about a theoretical problem which I would have come to talk about probably anyway in the course of these lectures, but which I think I might talk directly about now before resuming the regular plan of these lectures. And that is the problem of understanding violence, of not hating in response to violence, which is so much talked about these days, when in fact, of course, the main violence came from the man who murdered King, and from those, which may not be so few, who did not have the regret most Americans seem to have, and not from the reactive hostility which this murder arose in the poorest part of our population. But I want to suggest to you that here's a real problem, a real psychological problem of understanding perhaps I could be quite concrete by introducing the following thought which you often hear. Sometimes is expressed in the French saying, tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner. To understand everything means to forgive everything. If one understands evil and violence of this type which killed King, certainly is evil. It is the utmost of evil. That then indeed one can forgive. What does that mean? I'm sure many of you have heard, like I did in various statements about the murderer, of whom so far it is said one has the name, that he was a lunatic, that he was crazy. Well, I don't know how one knows that if one doesn't know who he is. But at any rate, let us assume he was crazy. So do we say then, because he was crazy, his act was not real? His act was an accident? In the first place, we know, and has happened in the last 50 years, that a number of crazy people have committed precisely the acts which were the political interests of a number of people who were by no means crazy. And that these people have created an atmosphere in which the crazy man pulls the trigger, even if you cannot demonstrate that he got instructions from anyone who had an interest in his pulling the trigger. To understand evil, to understand violence, means really to put oneself into the other person and to discover in oneself that nothing human is alien to one, that some of the same evilness is in all of us. And if one can fully put oneself into the other person, then indeed one does not hate. Then indeed one can fulfill the command of the New Testament, love thy enemy, because there is no more enemy, because I and he are one, because I am one with all of humanity. But very often, and this is what I'm talking about, this understanding leads to unrealism and sentimentality. This understanding then means, well, then nothing is so bad, nothing is so evil. One doesn't need to be so much concerned with it, because it's just crazy, it's just sick. And I'm trying to say that one should distinguish these two things completely. One is understanding, not only in the superficial psychological sense that one understands why a man did something. That's very little. Not talking about him, but in the deep human understanding of putting oneself into him and then ceasing to hate. But at the same time to be cynically realistic about what he did and why he did it, and what is a political function of what he did, and what are the consequences of his deed, and not to take a sentimental role that because we are all, this is all sick, this is all pathological, this is unconscious, and God knows what, we can shut our eyes to the very nature of the evil which is done. I don't know whether I can make myself quite clear enough in these few minutes about the paradox between not hating, not judging, and understanding on the one hand, and at the same time being utterly realistic and unsentimental. I would like to make it clear to you that I believe that the great insight, which not only exists since Freud, which exists since the Old Testament, or which exists since Balzac or Dostoevsky or Shakespeare, it doesn't matter, that all these insights into the nature of another man, which is in the last analysis an insight into ourselves, is one thing quite separate from unsentimental appreciation of the facts. The facts are not more rosy, are not less ominous, are not less dangerous, because I can put myself, because I do not hate, because I can put myself in the other person. If I may use a very trivial example, if I see a very bad painting, and somebody says to me, but the painter tried hard, and he was poor, and he had no time to study, then I can feel a deep sympathy with the painter. But if I start to say painting is good because he suffered so much, then I'm a sentimental fool. This is only a very innocent example. And I suggest that if we want to follow non-hating and not violence, we should not fall into complacency of sugarcoating facts, and should combine the most difficult of two qualities to be combined, namely that of ruthless realism in seeing facts and deep humanity in understanding and not hating. This topic, I think, will remain important in the discussions which will arise from now on, and perhaps increasingly. And if one is afraid that this destruction of men who present the best in humanity may not even stop with the death of Martin Luther King, then indeed one should be prepared for utter realism, and at the same time for a deep human understanding which makes hate impossible. However, one has to be able to afford it. There was a great man in this city, known over the world, although by far not as known as Martin Luther King, that was I.G. Muste, of whom I'm sure some of you knew, who said, "If I cannot love Hitler, I love nobody." This was not a phrase. This was as real and as authentic as any statement could be. But there are very few people who can afford to make that statement. only a very great man, a man of the depths of love and humanity as Muste, could make it legitimately. Those who make it and who have not reached the depth of understanding and humanity will easily make that statement and blur the facts and be prone to think that the evil of Hitler was, after all, not so evil. There was no man more aware of the evilness of Hitler than Muste, and yet he, but not everybody, could truthfully say that he loved him. Well, after these remarks, I might as well come back to where we were, because otherwise this plan of lecture gets too much out of order. I shall talk briefly about the conflict which Freud was in. I mentioned it last time, when he tried to mitigate the harshness of his tragic alternative that man can either destroy himself or destroy others. He suggested, it made several suggestions. One was that the superego could be charged with aggression, which otherwise would be directed towards others. But that is really no good answer, because if the superego is charged with that amount of aggression, which is biologically given in the death instinct, then indeed you would have a population with so guilt-ridden, with such a pathological, self-destructive attitude of self-accusation that even a Victorian moralist would be abhorred by the horror of this self-accusation and of this guilt. Another way he was, something else he was suggesting is perhaps sounds more plausible, although it really, in my opinion, is not, and that was that the death instinct, in his opinion, could be tamed to culturally valuable objects. He says here, I just quote one sentence, "The instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, and as it were inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed towards objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature." Now, that sounds good, but actually if you ask yourself, what is control over nature? Control over nature is construction, is agriculture, is building houses, is producing things. Nature is not controlled except by the, I was going to say except by nuclear weapons, but that's not a control of nature, but a destruction of nature. But otherwise, a control of nature in the process of civilization is a process of construction. And therefore, it is in a way play with words, or a very little tenable idea to say that destructiveness is transformed into control of nature, because destructiveness, the death instinct, wishes to undo life, and the control of nature, which is part of the process of life, wants to enhance life, to do something for life. Another way out of which Freud suggested was something which psychologists sometimes call redirection of aggressiveness, change of object. Well, that is also not very promising, because if that drive for destruction, which is anchored in the very biological nature of man, is directed toward whom is it changed? Into sports? Well, we have not seen that the Olympic Games have greatly contributed to a lowering of aggression in the world. In spite of the Olympic Games, aggression has increased and violence has increased tremendously in the last 30 years. Now, then Freud has another idea, which is a much more appealing idea in my own way of thinking, and that is that aggression, the death instinct, could be curbed or could be diminished by bringing in eros. He says here that anything that encourages the growth of emotional ties between men must operate against war. Indeed, but then this is not consistent with his basic premise, because if all nature, all living substance is characterized by the presence of an instinct for destruction, then how, and the eros is present at the other pole anyway, how can this instinct for destruction be done away with by that eros, which anyway is a one polarity, the one pole as against the death instinct? Where does that death instinct go? And the same answer holds true for something else which is most interesting in Freud's construction, and that is something which he talks not very much about, but it's very, very significant, and that is the idea that there is something like an organic repression of instincts. Perhaps I could read you just quickly one statement here where he says, in the end of the letter to Einstein, he speaks of the process of civilization as a factor leading to a lasting, as it were, constitutional, in quotes, organic repression of instincts. Now, what Freud is saying here is really a most significant statement, namely that in the process of civilization, the basic nature of man changes, that the instincts, if you please, dry out. They don't disappear completely, but they dry out. They become less strong. Aggressiveness becomes less violent, because that's really what is meant by organic repression, a formula in which he tries to keep to the word repression, which, however, really systematically doesn't make much sense here. It means that the drying off of aggressive instincts. But again, I'm afraid the same criticism must be leveled against this theory, because if all living substance is determined by these two forces, the force for life and the force for striving for death, how can this one pole be slowly drying up? How can it be diminished? What happens to the other, to the life instinct? What happens to the organic nature which Freud assumed to be the essence of the death instinct? If you would say that in terms of the older instinct theory, the one which most psychoanalysts have later on accepted, namely of a destructive instinct, then it would be much more plausible. But for the death instinct as being rooted in the very nature of living substance, it is very difficult to imagine how this force, how this power inherent in all life could be, in the process of civilization, be what he calls organically repressed. Now, naturally, I'm not trying here to cover this problem in any systematic form. This is a very complex problem. I mention it only because it's there, and those who are interested can read Freud and can think about it more. I'm now speaking about all the factors, and I try to be very brief, which make it appear that the theory, the hydraulic theory of Freud, and as I said, this is also basically the theory of Lorentz, why this theory does not really hold water. The first reason is, of course, and this has been pointed out by many psychoanalysts, that the whole construction of the death instinct in Freud is based on very, one has to say, flimsy evidence, like the compulsion to repeat and things like that, which clinically, empirically, really are very unconvincing. But I should like to mention the second element, or maybe I mention that a little later. I should like to mention first that also neurophysiological findings of the last years do not seem to, in any way, to confirm Freud's assumptions about, or for that matter, Lorenz's assumption about this hydraulically operative destructive drive. It seems that the best neurophysiological theory would go in the direction of the assumption that there is an aggressive potential. I spoke about that in the first lecture, that there is an aggressive potential in the neurophysiological organization of man, but that this potential needs to be reactivated by definite stimuli, by definite signals, and is not something which increases as time goes on and has to explode quite regardless of stimuli or provocations. Now, if you take another field where we could learn something about the aggressive instinct in Freud's sense, we would turn to the animal kingdom. And I should like to present you with a very simple consideration. Freud says himself, and that's perfectly logical, the death instinct, of course, would not only apply to man, but to all animals, because it is something inherent in living substance. Therefore, we would have to find evidence in the animal kingdom that those animals who are particularly aggressive don't harm themselves, and those animals which are particularly peaceful die earlier or get more sick or show any sign of this alternative between aggression outside and aggression inside. Now, there is nothing of the kind to be observed in the animal kingdom of any such alternative. And I would say, while the human material might be for many reasons more complex and more open to discussion, the animal material would clearly show that this alternative aggression either to the outside or to the inside just is not an alternative which can be shown in the reaction of animals. But in general, it has to be said that among the primates and the mammals in general, acts of aggression against their own species, members of their own species, are relatively rare. In fact, it might be said that if man had only the aggressive potential of the primates, then indeed he would be a most peaceful being and there would be very little bloodshed on this earth. Of course, this is a very extended field, and there is a great deal of literature about it. So let me just, to give you an example, quote a few statements from one of the best papers on this field by Hall in the very interesting book, Natural History of Aggression, a symposium on aggression, which, for those who are interested, is very valuable to read. He speaks there about observations among the baboons, which are among the more aggressive of the primate, and says, in all the species, intergroup spacing is achieved with the peculiar exception of the temple rhesus without fighting. The relationship between baboon groups are characterized by mutual tolerance or mutual avoidance according to the nature of their habitat. No aggressive interactions between groups have ever been recorded by Hall or DeVore in over 2,000 hours of observation. About the chimpanzees, the following statement. Aggressive and submissive interactions between individuals were infrequent, and the concept of a dominance hierarchy amongst the animals cannot be substantiated even among the temporary groupings. In a very interesting book on mountain gorillas by Scholl, who observed them in their habitat and not in the zoo, he states that interaction between groups were usually entirely peaceable. Well, now Lawrence gives a lot of examples from the geese and from the fish. Now, I understand from geneticists that it is a most doubtful procedure to assume that man has inherited qualities of the gray-lag geese and of certain types of fish if these same qualities are not to be found in the primates nor in the mammals. It is for geneticists to decide that, but it does not seem to be an acceptable idea to most geneticists. So we come really to the result, and you would have to read a good deal more about this literature, that the animal kingdom is not one in which you find any great aggressiveness against members of their own species, not even very much against other species, that you find on the whole a peaceful attitude. You find some primates like the chimpanzees who get kind of easily angry, but usually nothing happens. No attack, no hurting, nothing. It's just a matter of, you might say, what we would call an angry temperament. And in fact, this holds true for a great deal of what had been described by some observers among fights between animals. Some observers have been impressed that certain animals make a lot of noise, like if a man yells and shouts and gets red in the face, and they assume this means they are very aggressive. Now, we know that quite a few people easily shout and get red in the face, but they are not aggressive, and others are very aggressive who don't get red in the face and don't shout. This is an entirely different problem. So altogether, I would say one has to come to the conclusion that the evidence for the inheritance of aggressiveness from the animal kingdom is negative. Now, let me say a few words about the anthropological material. Perhaps first one remark, and that is, you would expect that there are quite a number of books, or at least one book in anthropology, which would deal systematically with destructiveness and aggressiveness among animals. Because, after all, this is not a new problem. This is a very important human problem, and you would expect that anthropologists would have given enough attention to it to write several, or at least one, large systematic work about it. But there is nothing. There is practically, there are a number of papers which deal with this aspect or that aspect. There are a number of descriptions of various tribes in which you have a lot of description about their aggressiveness, their warfare. There is a book on war which takes on the whole problem of war among nations, among tribes, but the material on primitive societies, although very abundant, actually is rather meaningless because the categories are rather meaningless. But there is no thorough work where you could go and orient yourself to say, well, primitive society, in primitive societies, aggressiveness or destructiveness is such and such. You can make some generalizations. You are just lost there. Well, I can only report then about, and a good deal, for instance, there is one paper by Professor Freeman, which is written from a strictly dogmatic Freudian viewpoint, and it's a paper of about 15 pages in which he sees nothing but aggressiveness in humans, and in which he explains that as a natural consequence of the death instinct. I shall talk in a little while about the frequency of aggressiveness in human beings. I'm still talking about now among primitive societies. Perhaps I could mention two examples here. I recently used 28 tribes which are described in books by Murdoch, by Margaret Mead, and by Ruth Benedict in their description of various tribes, not from the standpoint of destructiveness or aggressiveness, but from other standpoints. And I made my own statistics, so to speak, about what is the incidence of destructiveness among these 28 tribes which are described there. And I found that if I follow the material as it is offered, you find three very distinct groups of or kinds of aggressiveness or non-aggressiveness. You find tribes, non-literate or primitive tribes, whatever you call them, which are exceedingly unaggressive, friendly, kind, human, and in which there is no place for war, in which there is no place for human aggression at all, or hardly any. This is one part. The other extreme, you find cultures which are cruel, sadistic, necrophilous, with marked cruelty, marked aggressiveness. And you find others where you find, you might say a little bit like our own, that they are basically not vicious, sadistic, but nevertheless also they do not have that disarming quality of peacefulness which some of the first group have, but they are perfectly willing to engage in war, but without the cruelty, the torture, and the hate and violence which you find typically in the second group I mentioned. And if you analyze if you take this little statistical survey, then you find that the first group, the peaceful group, comprises 9, the extremely vicious and cruel group comprises 11, and the in-between group comprises 8 of the 28 tribes which are to be found in the description of these three authors. That is, roughly speaking, 1/3 for each. I want to mention another another work on the same subject matter by an author, Stuart Palmer, Murder and Suicide in 40 Non-Literate Societies. He took very different societies from the ones I took, and he came to the conclusion that among these 40 societies, 13 were above the median score, both for murder and suicide. This work was meant to examine the Freudian thesis that aggression went either against oneself or against others, so that you would have to find empirically that if you have much aggression against others, you have little aggression against oneself, and vice versa. Now he found that in 13 there was a higher aggression both for murder and suicide, while in 14 others there was low aggression both in murder and suicide, and only in the rest it was such that the combined that there was a difference between murder and suicide. Now I found something very similar in a statistic which I took from the World Health Organization data, which are published in the Sane Society. And that is, you have there the data for suicide and homicide separated. Now, it is true that in general, in countries where you have much homicide, you have little suicide. And in countries where you have much suicide, you have little homicide. But you have to consider that this goes together with another fact. You have the industrialized country with little homicide and with a good deal of suicide, and the poor countries with little suicide and much homicide. Now, there are some reasons which I cannot enter into here for the fact that industrialized countries you have little homicide, while you have in poor countries a great deal more homicide. And it's very interesting to read the best data which Durkheim has published, for instance, in his study on suicide, which is still a classic study, to see how in Germany, during the 19th century, in the second part of the 19th century, with increasing industrialization, suicide rates increase. My own interpretation of it is really that in the cash society, life itself becomes a business. And if you fail in your business, then indeed you might as well kill yourself. That life becomes a function of success, of economic success, and economic failure is a basis for suicide. Naturally, you don't have this perverted scheme in poor countries. In poor countries, you have an entirely different phenomenon, and that is less control, more alcoholism, and all sorts of factors which lead to more homicide. Actually, what I found is when I added both homicide and suicide as destructive acts together, then that you found that they range for the Western countries from a maximum of 35 per 100,000 destructive acts in Denmark and 24 in the United States to 4% to 4 by 100,000 in Ireland, and very little also in Italy. In other words, here you also do not find at all that the number of homicides is balanced by the number of suicides, but you find that if you combine the two, there are still tremendous differences in destructiveness per se, and you have to find out what is the answer to this rather than to that you can complain it on the basis of the drive, the destructive drive, which either leads to homicide or leads to suicide. It just isn't so. Well, if we speak then about individual differences, I think that any observer of men, whether he is a psychiatrist or whether he is a layman, and some laymen are better observers sometimes than psychiatrists, knows very well when he sees a destructive, vicious, hostile person, and when he sees a person who is good-natured and undestructive. Now, if you stick to the Freudian theory, then of course you say, yes, but unconsciously, this man who is so, who looks so nice and so well-meaning and all that, unconsciously imagine the amount of destructiveness he has. Well, it isn't so. And let me give you a very simple example. Assuming a man comes to a psychiatrist today and says, "Doctor, I hate my wife, I hate my children, I hate everybody, I wish they were all dead." Well, the psychiatrist wouldn't say, "Oh, well, that's a matter of taste, a matter of values." The psychiatrist would see immediately that this man is either severely sick, perhaps psychotic, or that all this may not be genuine, that he's just talking that way, and he may see in his eyes a very gentle, sweet expression which belies the whole talk. And then he will treat him, will find out that after a while it turns out that this man has hardened his heart at some point, got very angry against the whole world, but that he doesn't really mean what he says, or doesn't even mean what he feels. All that has happened with him is he has hardened his heart. But if the psychiatrist sees that expression in his face of uncompromising hostility and destructiveness, and if that is so generalized that hardly anybody is left or nobody is left, then he knows this man is very sick. Now, here you have the peculiar thing that while in general, or many psychiatrists claim that value judgments should not enter into psychiatric judgments, here the value judgment and psychiatric judgment are identical. A person who is so full of hate is a sick person, because man is not born to be so full of hate. Man is born to live, with the exception of perhaps some constitutionally sick people, just as you have congenital morons or congenital idiots. But that is not the average man. That are great exceptions which have their very special reasons. In fact, you see, you find that just as you find a very vicious, destructive person, you recognize the sadist. You recognize a person who has a pleasure, who is not just destructive, but who has a pleasure in suffering, who has a pleasure in complete control over another person, whether he's a bureaucrat behind the window who just enjoys the fact that people have to wait and then they don't get anything, or whether he's a man who can find sexual enjoyment only by inflicting pain upon a woman. It is all the same. There is a pleasure in what I would call absolute control. I shall talk about that more later in these lectures. But you see it. You see the mouth. You see the smile. You see the something. If you observe it all, you see the sometimes hidden and sometimes not so hidden pleasure. You watch some pictures of police beating up people. Now, sometimes you see there is a facial expression which is not sadistic. They are just doing their duty. But sometimes you will see a man with an elated, almost ecstatic facial expression of sadism in the moment of violence. In other words, and it is not at all so that the very same people who have an enjoyment of life, who love people, who enjoy the growth and aliveness of people, that these people hate themselves. This is just plain nonsense. And every psychiatric and psychological observation shows it. I wished you wouldn't read so many books and wouldn't go to these lectures, including mine. And instead of that, you would begin to observe. There is so much to see. We have now, for instance, a wonderful instrument, television, which in general only offers the worst things, but sometimes it does offer something good, and that is, it permits one to see rather nakedly a person's face and his facial impression. Now, I would think as long as people are manipulated by words, they are rather lost, because people are naive and believe, well, they know the words are untrue, just as they know that the toothpastes, various kinds of toothpaste, are all the same, and yet they are impressed by it. But if you watch a face, and if you really know that you can see a lot about the man in his face, in his gesture, in his voice, in his hands, in his posture, in many things, then indeed you don't need so many specialists. And our democracy would work a great deal better if the voters saw the faces of the men for whom they vote, rather than to listen to their words. This is a matter of practice and training, and everybody has access to it. There's no secret. But we are so accustomed to take words for an ultimate expression of what is real that we have become awfully stupid. We have become more gullible than children. And in fact, as I shall try to show later, the problem of aggressiveness is to a large extent in the world a problem of gullibility rather than of a destructive instinct. But that I shall try to make a little bit clearer as these lectures go on. Now then, this would lead to the conclusion that man is really not destructive because of the innate destructive instinct. He is not destructive because the genetic factor of the inheritance of animal destructiveness. For all these reasons, he is not destructive. In fact, if he were only as destructive, as I said before, as the animals, everything would be just fine. But the fact is, as some observers have noted, that man is much more destructive than animals are. That hardly any animal species equals man in viciousness, aggressiveness, destructiveness. And we have the problem, the paradoxical problem, not the problem as Lawrence puts it or Freud puts it, to explain man's destructiveness on the basis of certain innate instincts, but to explain man's destructiveness, which is greater than that of other animals, by the very specific conditions of human existence. Man's destructiveness is a product of our human qualities. And were it not for our human qualities, this destructiveness would at least not be greater than that of the primates. Now, what human qualities am I talking about here? There's nothing mysterious about it. Awareness, imagination, the capacity for loneliness, the capacity for boredom, and a sense of impotence. All these are qualities which are specifically human. And the thesis I shall try to follow up here is the thesis that indeed human aggressiveness can be understood only by an examination of what these specific human qualities, which are the very best we have, can create under circumstances in which they lead to the very worst in us. And I can already say at this point that I think these instinctive theories, like that of Freud or of Lawrence and a few others, only serve to obscure the real questions. As long as we think we explain war, we explain violence, we explain hate by the assumption of a hate and aggressive instinct, we don't look for the real psychological and for the real economic and social and cultural problems which produce this kind of destructiveness. And so, and it's very interesting that these books again have become very popular. The book of Lawrence, for instance, and some others. People are freed from the obligation to come to grips with the question of destructiveness as long as they can believe that it's just man's nature. I read recently about the legend in one tribe in South America, I forgot which one it was, who have the legend that man was made from the blood which flew from one god in the sky, and this blood, for them blood is destructive and aggressive, and because man is made of this blood, man has an aggressive nature. And then they had to explain, but why are some people like cowards and women who are not aggressive? And they said, well, they are just not made of that blood, they are made of something else. Well, that is a legend of a primitive tribe. I don't think it is a bit worse than the more sophisticated assumption that man is so destructive because he has a destructive instinct. It's essentially the same model of explaining something by hypothesizing an instinct for it, and therefore not to see what are the realities, what are the real psychological problems which we have to look for. And there are plenty. Now, next time I shall begin with what then is the program for the rest of these lectures, namely to discuss various types of qualitatively different types of aggression or destructiveness. I might indicate at this point before I stop what they are, namely aggression or destructiveness or destruction without destructive motive, as destructive acts without destructive motivations. Second, defensive destructiveness. Third, sadistic destructiveness. And eventually necrophilous destructiveness. But this means relatively little to you right now. I shall try to develop the idea in the description, what is meant by these various kinds of destructiveness, and that each of them, being qualitatively different, has entirely different motivations. And that only if we understand their distinctness can we understand the motivation for each. As I said before, I believe, as long as we believe that there is a generalized thing, aggressiveness or destructiveness, we can never find the reason, because there cannot be one reason for phenomena which are quite distinct. And therefore, the search for the causes of destructiveness is quite futile. Thank you. We have now a little usual intermission and then some time for questions. Sir, I didn't mean that, I just meant a little bit more light here. I made this suggestion to have a little bit more light here because somebody wrote me in a note that apropos of my observation about seeing people, it is not fair that I should be seen only by the people who sit here and not by the people in the audience. Now, I think that's perfectly fair. I wasn't aware that I am not visible for the people in the audience, but I want to explain to you that if I cannot see the audience, it's very difficult for me to talk. So I hope we can, with this lighting, you can see me? All right. Now, there are a few questions. That is to say, quite a few, but I can only answer a few. Here's the following question. Marx once said that we are still in a state of pre-existence. Are we to understand that aggression or destruction belongs to the pre-existence, and if we should enter existence, human existence, aggression would not be present? Well, I have to correct the statement a little bit. Marx did not speak of pre-existence, but of prehistory. He said, all human history so far is prehistory, and human history will begin only with when human freedom is fully established, or you might say when man ceases to be like the animal who has to spend most of his time seeking for food. Or you might say, and Marx does not say that, but it is, he did not the works of Professor Skinner, and probably might not even have guessed that this would be the fashion in the United States as well as in the Soviet Union, although they are not under the name of Professor Skinner, but under slightly different headaches. I'm sorry, I said headaches. That was a slip of the tongue. I meant headings, of course. But it is quite a headache. was going to say was one could express the same thing in the following way. So far, the history of man is a history of a domesticated animal. Man controlled his instincts, his drives to a large extent by the process of conditioning. And before one knew about Professor Skinner and Pavlov, it was very well known. If you frighten a person enough, he will eventually learn the signals and act according to what is called reinforcements in one way or another, and if you give certain rewards, he will act accordingly. Man's behavior to a large extent has been determined by punishment and reward, that is to say, by methods of conditioning. And you might as well consider the fact that the large new brain which man has absolutely nothing to do with the control by conditioning, because you can do that with rats, with cats, with animals whose brain is not comparable to that of man, and man's brain is not even comparable to that of the primates. You don't need much of a brain, of a new brain, in order to control your actions as much as they are simply determined by sheer instinctive responses. You might raise a question that the time has not yet begun where man makes really full use of his brain. And that does not mean of his thinking only. It means of all the new dimensions which are specifically human. We are still thinking about man mechanistically in terms of here are these instincts and they are controlled, but we know that man has qualities and faculties which transcend far that which you find in the animal. His sense of beauty, his sense of tenderness, his sense of joy, his way of listening to music, his sense of relating himself to other people. One cannot even begin to talk about all those human faculties which are specifically human, which have to do with awareness, with imagination, with the concept of self, which are indeed human and which you don't find in the animal. Now, if Professor Lawrence speaks about the fact that certain acts of the gray-lag geese have the analogy in the behavior between the Russian and the American government, then I think this is plain nonsense, because this is an analogizing between a certain type of animal behavior and a highly complex behavior of statesmen, which Dr. Lawrence doesn't even begin to understand. The animal behavior he may, but not the human behavior. In other words, what we can call here, if we refer to Marx as prehistory, it is that stage of human development where man as man comes into his own and where he begins to transcend with a new human reaction the old set of animal reactions which are relatively determined, relatively set, although the higher up you go in the animal kingdom, the less so. Man hasn't even begun yet to make use of it, and maybe he couldn't have, because indeed in a world in which there was never enough to eat for all, necessarily man was split between those who gave commands and got the rewards and those who had to work and could not share, could not sit on the table because there wasn't enough for all. Now, that is unfortunately still the situation if we look at the world as a whole. In fact, it is a situation, it's a gap which becomes greater rather than smaller, as all of you are interested in the problem know, that the difference between the poor nations and the rich nations, in spite of all increasing productivity of industry in the West is becoming larger, that we are actually, according to some experts, and very serious one, threatened already with large-scale famines in about 10 years because we avoid even thinking and making plans which would lead to a common life of all nations on this world. Now, what effects that will have on the history of man, on the development of man, or whether that might not simply end in the radical solution of nuclear war, in which will take care of the population explosion and will take care of almost everything in the most nihilistic sense, is another question. Marx was not thinking of this. And this is the tragic situation of the moment, that indeed we have in principle the means for a new period of human life, not only in America, but in the long run in the whole world, if we make use of what we know and if we make intelligent use, rather than to live day by day and use violence whenever we cannot manage what we should be able to manage. Here's a question. Animals have their enemies in other species. Perhaps in man the place of species is taken by the group, the nation, the class, or the caste, and these may become enemies. Well, that is indeed a very interesting idea, which has been sometimes discussed in the literature, whether we can really speak in the same sense of the experience of species in man as the animal the animal experiences as a member of the same species. Of course, if one starts out on a purely biological basis, then we are one species. But actually, I don't think that the main reason for the hostility between various groups and classes is based on something which could be compared or which is analogous to the hostility in animals among the species, because even there the hostility is not so particularly great. I shall try in the course of these lectures to answer this question more fully. That is to say, why, in my opinion, you have so much hostility between certain groups and less among others, and what are the real sources of human destructiveness, rather than to explain them by an extension of an innate destructiveness only against another group instead of another species. Here's a question, and this is not the only one. Why did you decide to leave out Lawrence after you had scheduled it? Well, I did say last time why I left it out. I do not have any sinister motive to leave it out. On the contrary, it is quite, in a way, a sacrifice which I bring you. I have written 70 pages in a book manuscript on this topic about Lawrence. It would be much easier for me to talk an hour about Lawrence because I have it all written down. I left it out because, as I explained before, I thought it was more valuable to spend an hour more time, as I did on Freud, than on Lawrence, because Freud's theory is so much more profound, so much more interesting, that I think with a limited amount of time, I offer you something more interesting than talking about Lawrence, which is really basically not very interesting, partly very superficial, and hardly gives any occasion for serious discussion, except showing how nonsensical most of his conclusions are and most of his analogies are between animals and human beings. So for those, I have to apologize, and I did apologize last time, for those who have expected this 1 hour about Lawrence and have come here for this reason and wanted specifically to hear about Lawrence. I am sorry to have disappointed them, but I did so because I felt an hour more about Freud was, for most of you, more valuable. If we could vote about it, then majority of you might vote that it isn't so, and then, of course, you might be right, although not necessarily. The layman hears of and believes in the instinct of self-preservation. As an example, I jump aside when an auto careens towards me. But how common in daily life is an instinct for self-destruction? Well, indeed, I don't think that is in itself very common, as I shall try to show. You do find attitudes of self-destruction which, as I shall try to say, have mostly an irrational and pathological content. The normal thing is, in man and animal, that he tries to save his life, either by flight or by attack. Therefore, jumping away from a car is following the laws of nature, while offering oneself to be run over would require a good deal of explanation beyond that of the assumption that the destructive instinct has been turned inwards, which really says nothing. When you say we must look upon acts of violence in a cynical, unsentimental, realistical fashion, are you suggesting that we ought to formulate better means of punishment or better means of cure? Or are only some forms of violence curable? Well, I'm very glad that somebody asked this question, because indeed I'm afraid that I might not have been understood by everybody rightly in what I meant to convey, especially since I was talking very briefly about a very complicated subject. First, I was not speaking in favor of more punishment. I think punishment is in the realm of conditioning. It does not change anything. It's born out of a feeling of hate, and only under very special circumstances might you want to isolate a person to prevent that he does more harm, but certainly under no circumstances would I be in favor of killing or punishing by death anybody, regardless of the crime he has committed. So I'm not asking for more and better punishment. What I meant by a realistic understanding is something quite different. It is simply to understand the reality of what goes on in the act of destructiveness here. That means understanding the whole situation. What could be the political, psychological motivations of the assassin? What could he have been influenced? What is the chance of actions which go in that, which repeat the same act toward other people, against other people? It would imply the question, how can the citizens of the United States and the citizens of the world, what can they do to change a situation which threatens to deteriorate into violence, but not by preaching and not by sentimental words, but by attitudes and actions which are convincing? A little bit of an example of this has been given by Mayor Lindsay here. I found this quite impressive because it was an unbureaucratic, human, courageous way of dealing with the human situation. But that is only a small part of the whole problem. It means to see where are we going. It means to see, for instance, why are men who represent the best in men, why are they assassinated? Is there something in a large group of men who cannot tolerate the presence of decency and of faith and of courage, because if these men live, they are shown up as enemies of life, and hence they must hate the men who present that which they cannot fulfill in themselves. One has to look into the political implications in every sense. Such a murder is a very complex affair. It's not just a lunatic who commits an act, even if he would turn out to be a lunatic. It's not just a lunatic, as I tried to say before. You can understand everybody, but then to say, well, he is only sick, this is only pathological, and hence the evil is not quite real. That is something quite different from not hating, from understanding a profoundly human sense, and yet being very aware of the whole reality which goes on. Now, I don't think I can do a much better job in 5 minutes more to explain what I mean about this. I would ask you to try it out, provided you are interested, in really thinking a great deal about what all the ramifications of such a murder are, of its consequences, of its causes, of the possibilities of reacting to it, and to distinguish this from the personal attitude toward the murderer, to distinguish this from a vengefulness or hate against the murderer, which is an entirely different story. Now, before I stop, I just want to say one word. I used the word cynical awareness of reality. I'm aware that this might be misunderstood. I hope it would be understood. The point is, I use a very strong word in order to indicate as strongly as I can that our realism must be so free from all sentimentality, from all fuzziness, that it might appear cynical to those who believe that the Reader's Digest is the ultimate of reality. And I would prefer to be cynical in this sense than to be sentimental. I'm not really cynical, and I don't wish you to be cynical. But I believe that what we need for the very hard times we are passing through and which we shall pass through is that combination which is not so much in our tradition, namely of deep faith, of deep love, and at the same time of an utterly hard-headed, realistic awareness of all the facts. Thank you.